Hi, everyone. Welcome back to LifeUp Podcast. Ever feel like you're constantly bumping into unexpected walls in life, making the same mistakes again and again?
But maybe you've just wondered how some people seem to navigate things, complex situations with a bit more savvy.
Exactly. Well, today we're going to arm you with some powerful mental tools. Tools to understand why things happen the way they do and how to maybe steer clear of those costly errors.
Think of it like a shortcut to becoming more world-wise. And we're drawing this straight from the introduction of the great mental models, Vol.3.
That's right. Forget dry theory.
Yeah, we've pulled out a cluster of ideas, sort of interconnected ideas, from the book specifically for you, our listener. The goal is to help you absorb valuable knowledge quickly, effectively.
So our mission for this deep dive, we're exploring the fascinating interplay of systems and mathematics through the lens of these mental models.
We're really aiming for those satisfying aha moments, the kind that suddenly illuminate how the world around you, works.
Absolutely. And as always, our conversation is rooted firmly in the source material.
Which in this case is, carefully selected insights from the great mental models, Vol.3.
So, buckle up. We're starting with a concept that's pretty fundamental to understanding, almost everything. Feedback loops.
Feedback loops? Okay.
At its heart, a feedback loop is simply the information, right? The information that tells you if you're heading towards your goal or maybe veering off track.
It's the "are we there yet" signal for any system. It's the return signal. You act.
And the environment reacts, or people react, even your own internal state.
Right, and that reaction, that feedback, it then influences your very next action. Now consider this. Adam Smith?
The economics guy.
The father of modern economics, yeah. He believed this exact process shapes our sense of right and wrong, our morality.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. So
Okay.
Smith thought morality isn't just some abstract rule book.
No, not at all. It's something we learn through the constant feedback we get from other people.
So if you act in a way others don't like,
You'll probably get a negative reaction, negative feedback.
and if you do something admirable, praiseworthy.
You get positive feedback. And that really deep-seated human desire, to be accepted, to be loved.
That becomes a powerful governor on our behavior.
Exactly. He even mused that someone raised in complete isolation wouldn't even have a concept of morality because they'd lack that external feedback.
Wow, okay. So what's fascinating here is how this fundamental mechanism just ripples through so many parts of our lives.
It really does. And the book points out, consciously thinking about maybe even adjusting these feedback loops, it can be incredibly useful.
For what kind of things?
Well, for tackling everyday challenges, things like breaking bad habits or dealing with misinformation, even building trust in our relationships.
Interesting. How can we practically, tweak a feedback loop to help us?
Okay, think about trying to cut down on sugary drinks, maybe for yourself or someone else.
Right.
Instead of an outright ban, which often backfires, right? You could make the healthier options just slightly more appealing, more accessible.
And the sugary ones.
A little less so. Maybe the water is ice cold right there in front. The soda is, tucked away in the back of the fridge.
So you're influencing choices at the margins. You subtly alter the feedback, the ease, the immediate reward.
Exactly. Making the desired behavior the slightly easier path.
That's clever. Now, the book also talks about something called information cascades. It calls them a kind of turbocharged feedback loop. What's that about?
Okay, imagine a crowd of people and they all suddenly start running in the same direction.
Okay.
An information cascade is kind of like that. It's where we see others making a choice, and that observation becomes this powerful piece of information for us. So powerful it often overrides our own initial judgment.
Like with stock market panics.
Perfect example. Investors see others selling shares, that can trigger a cascade. Others follow suit, not because they necessarily have bad news themselves.
But just because everyone else is selling. The selling itself becomes the signal.
Exactly. It's like we assume they must know something we don't, even if that's not true.
And the book uses social media virality as another example of this cascading feedback, right?
Spot on. A post gets a few initial likes or shares. That signals to the algorithm, hey, this might be interesting.
So the algorithm shows it to more people.
And those people, seeing the initial likes, are more likely to engage themselves. It creates this self-reinforcing loop.
Often without much regard for whether the content is actually good or true.
Precisely. The feedback, the likes, the shares just drives more visibility and more engagement.
So we're constantly looking for signals from others, especially when we're unsure. Which brings us to Anthony Bourdain's famous advice.
Yes. Always choose the busiest restaurant.
A perfect real-world example of this.
It is, and what's fascinating is how that simple tip uses the power of signaling and a reinforcing feedback loop.
How so?
Well, a busy restaurant signals good food, good service, right? So restaurateurs often seat the first customers near the window.
To amplify that signal, make it look busy early on.
Exactly. That initial buzz attracts more people. It creates a virtuous cycle. The crowd itself is the best advertisement.
It's pure social proof. Okay, let's shift slightly. The book connects feedback loops to building trust. How do those two intertwine?
Well, trust fundamentally is built on a history of positive feedback. Simple as that.
Our past interactions with someone.
And their reputation, which is really just the collected feedback from other people.
That all gives us information. It helps us decide whether to trust them next time.
Exactly. The book even brings up the prisoner's dilemma to illustrate this.
The classic game theory puzzle. Cooperation versus betrayal. How does that fit in?
Well, the iterated version, where you play the game multiple times with the same person, that really shows how repeated interactions can foster cooperation, build trust.
Through feedback.
Yes, the tit-for-tat strategy, which the book highlights, is a perfect example of a feedback loop building trust.
Remind me how tit-for-tat works.
You start by cooperating. You signal trust. Then, in the next round, you just copy whatever your opponent did last time.
Okay, so if they cooperated, you cooperate.
Yeah.
If they defected.
You defect. It creates this direct feedback loop. Cooperation gets rewarded with cooperation. Defection is punished with demection.
And over time, that can lead to a stable pattern of trust.
Exactly. It's about establishing a predictable pattern and responding clearly. Trust grows from that ongoing feedback exchange.
Right. Finally, on feedback loops, the book stresses their role in learning, in getting better at things. It uses the artist Kandinsky as an example.
Yes, and this is a really crucial point. Every attempt we make, every experiment, it gives us feedback.
If we pay attention to it.
Right. If we pay attention and incorporate those lessons, we gradually improve. Kandinsky's process is a great illustration.
He didn't just paint a masterpiece straight off.
Not at all. The book says over 5 months, he did 20 sketches for just one painting.
20 sketches.
And each one was only slightly different from the last. Each sketch gave him feedback, guiding his next stroke, his next color choice.
So the final painting was the result of 20 feedback-informed iterations.
Exactly. That image of 20 attempts, each feeding into the next, really drives home how vital that loop is for any learning, any creative act.
So summing up feedback loops, they're the engines of growth, of change. The system's output loops back, influences its input, constantly shaping things.
Precisely. And just becoming more aware of these loops, paying attention to the feedback we give and get, it gives us huge insights into how systems work.
And where we might be able to step in and make positive changes.
Absolutely. It also really highlights how important iteration is, being responsive to the information the world sends back to us.
Okay, great. Let's move on to our next essential mental model. Equilibrium.
Equilibrium, the system's comfort zone.
Right. The book describes it as that stable state. But it makes an important distinction, doesn't it, between static equilibrium.
Like a perfectly balanced scale, never moves.
And dynamic equilibrium, which is more relevant.
Much more relevant for most real-world systems. Dynamic equilibrium is more like a tightrope walker.
Constantly making small adjustments to stay balanced.
Exactly. It's a state of ongoing movement, self-correction, all driven by those feedback loops we just talked about. That's what allows a system to stay stable, despite things changing inside and out.
The book uses a really good analogy. A family household trying to maintain this dynamic equilibrium. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Think about a family managing its finances, keeping the house reasonably tidy. Those are variables that they're trying to keep in balance.
Okay.
Now, if they add something new, like piano lessons for a child, that puts a strain on the finances.
So they need to adjust something else to maintain financial equilibrium.
Right, maybe cut back on eating out or entertainment spending. Something has to give to rebalance.
And getting a pet.
Introduces more mess, right. So they need to put more time and effort into cleaning to maintain their desired level of household tidiness, their equilibrium for cleanliness.
So the family unit, the system, is constantly adjusting, rebalancing, responding to changes to stay within its sort of acceptable range.
That's the idea of dynamic equilibrium in action.
And the book points out that biological systems are absolute masters at this, maintaining homeostasis through constant information processing.
Oh, definitely. Our bodies are nonstop monitoring and regulating tons of variables: core temperature, blood sugar, electrolyte levels.
Without that constant flow of information and the adjustments.
The system would fall out of balance very quickly. It highlights just how critical information is for maintaining equilibrium. Which brings us to things like healthcare.
Right, the doctor-patient relationship. This leads to the modern approach, shared decision-making, or SDM, which the book mentions. How does equilibrium connect here?
Well, SDM basically acknowledges that medicine often involves uncertainty. There isn't always just one right answer.
Okay.
So for patients to make truly informed choices that feel right for them, they need good information. They need to understand the pros and cons of different options.
So you need that transparent flow of information between doctor and patient.
Exactly. And trust is absolutely essential for that flow. So information can be shared openly, understood clearly.
And used to reach a decision that works for the patient, aligns with their values. It's about finding a shared understanding, a kind of equilibrium in the decision-making.
Yes. The example in the book about parents in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, really makes this point powerfully.
Yeah, that parental dissatisfaction often wasn't just about the medical outcome, but about feeling unheard, like their concerns weren't acknowledged.
And small things, like the staff just using the baby's name, could make a huge difference in communication, building trust.
Helping restore a sense of equilibrium in a terribly stressful time.
Exactly. Now, the book uses a really cool example from Magic Ralph Hall's Tune Deck trick to illustrate thinking about equilibrium differently.
A magic trick, how does it relate?
Well, Hall's genius was disrupting the expected equilibrium of a card trick. Normally, a trick has one core secret, right? One method.
And the audience, or other magicians, try to figure out that one secret.
Exactly. But Hull's tuned deck, it didn't rely on just one secret. He used a clever mix of multiple techniques, subtly shifting between them.
Ah, so there wasn't one single equilibrium point to find.
Precisely. By not sticking to the expected equilibrium of one trick, one secret, he completely baffled everyone, even experts. He created a new kind of balance through complexity.
Clever. Okay, finally, on equilibrium, the book shares the story of Biosphere 2, the big enclosed ecosystem experiment.
Right, the cautionary tale.
How does that incredibly ambitious and ultimately challenging experiment relate to maintaining equilibrium?
Biosphere 2 was this huge attempt to create a totally self-sustaining ecosystem, sealed off for 2 years.
And it ran into problems.
Major problems, unexpected ones. Oxygen levels plummeted, they couldn't grow enough food, social dynamics got really tense.
So it didn't achieve that goal of perfect closed system equilibrium.
No, but even in its quote-unquote failure, it provided invaluable lessons. It showed the staggering complexity of maintaining ecological balance in a closed system.
Even the unexpected things, like which species thrived and which died off,
Offered crucial data. It highlighted the intricate, often unpredictable connections within Earth's own biosphere. It was a stark demonstration of how delicate equilibrium is in complex systems, even with careful planning.
It really shows how fragile that balance can be. Okay, shifting gears again. Our next mental model. Bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks, okay.
What exactly is a bottleneck in a system?
It's basically the point of greatest constraint, the part under the most strain. It's what limits the overall flow or output of the entire system.
Like the narrowest part of a funnel.
Exactly like that, or the narrowest part of a river. It dictates how much can get through, no matter how wide things are before or after it.
And the book stresses that trying to improve a system anywhere but the bottleneck
Is largely a waste of time and resources. You're just piling things up before the constraint, or leaving capacity idle after it.
because improving other parts just creates more pressure or backlog at that limiting point. It won't speed up the whole system significantly.
Precisely. And here's a key point the book makes. Every system has a bottleneck. Always.
You can't eliminate them entirely.
Nope. Addressing one bottleneck will just mean some other part of the system becomes the new limiting factor. It's a continuous process.
But knowing where your bottlenecks are is crucial.
Absolutely. It lets you anticipate problems, allocate resources smartly, and even spot opportunities for innovation by focusing on relieving that specific constraint.
The book shares a great anecdote about a clothing manufacturer and the bottleneck being cheap thread.
Yes. This is a perfect example of how something seemingly tiny can become a critical bottleneck with huge costs.
What happens?
So the manufacturer, to save just a tiny bit per spool, switched to cheaper, lower quality thread.
Okay, seems like a small saving.
But the cheap thread kept breaking in the sewing machines, constantly.
Causing downtime.
Massive downtime. It led to a huge drop in overall production. That tiny saving, maybe 15 cents per spool, ended up costing them something like $150 an hour in lost productivity.
Wow. That's a stark reminder not to just optimize one little piece in isolation. You have to look at the whole system.
Exactly. Optimizing for cost without seeing the system impact can create these killer bottlenecks.
The book also talks about building the Trans-Siberian Railway,
Yeah.
a massive project with, I imagine, tons of bottlenecks.
Oh, the TSR project was a masterclass in bottlenecks. Huge distances, tough logistics.
What kind of things held it up?
Constant shortages of materials, steel, timber, terrible weather stopping construction, and communication delays were a big one because decisions were all centralized way back in St. Petersburg.
And fixing one problem sometimes created another.
Often, yes. Trying to build faster to meet deadlines sometimes meant cutting corners on quality, which then led to more repairs and slowdowns later. Even after it was built, new bottlenecks popped up, like not enough trains or inefficient freight handling.
So dealing with bottlenecks in huge, complex systems means thinking about the ripple effects, the unintended consequences.
You have to. But on a more positive note, the book points out that bottlenecks can actually drive innovation.
How so? Especially during scarce times, like war.
That's a really key insight. When resources get tight, when something critical is missing, it forces people to think differently, find alternatives.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Pretty much. The book gives great examples from wartime. Nylon, for instance.
Nylon?
Yeah, developed as a substitute for silk, mainly for parachutes, when Japanese silk supplies were cut off around World War II.
And it turned out to be useful for lots of other things, too.
Exactly. Not only did it solve the immediate bottleneck, but nylon turned out to be superior in many ways and revolutionized textiles, plastics, all sorts of industries.
And medicine also saw big leaps driven by wartime bottlenecks.
Huge leaps. The sheer number of injuries and the desperate need for treatments pushed things forward fast.
Like what?
The American Civil War saw big advances in prosthetics, surgical techniques like ligatures. World War II forced the mass production of penicillin, which saved countless lives.
Penicillin, right?
And even earlier, World War I, dealing with rickets caused by poor nutrition and lack of sunlight, they discovered UV lamps could treat it effectively. That addressed a critical bottleneck caused by rationing.
So these constraints forced creative solutions that ended up benefiting everyone long after the crisis.
Absolutely. It shows how bottlenecks, while there are limitations, can also be these unexpected sparks for creativity and progress, pushing us to find better ways.
So to wrap up bottlenecks, they're the choke points, slowing everything down. And the strength of the whole system depends on that weakest link.
Precisely. Identifying and strategically managing those bottlenecks is key to improving performance, resilience, the whole effectiveness of any system, whether it's a factory, an organism, or even just our own workflow.
Okay, great. Let's dive into our final mental model for today.
Scale.
Scale. Things getting bigger or smaller.
And the book kicks this off by saying something pretty counterintuitive. Doubling inputs doesn't automatically mean doubling outputs.
Right. It highlights the nonlinearity of scaling.
What does that mean in practical terms? Non-linearity. It means as systems grow or shrink, the relationships between their parts and their overall behavior can change in unpredictable ways.
So what works great on a small scale?
Might become inefficient or unwieldy or just completely break down when you try to magnify it.
The book uses baking a cake as an analogy.
Yeah, a simple one, but effective. Doubling a cake recipe doesn't always give you two identical perfect cakes. Things like heat distribution in a bigger pan can change the result. It's not just simple multiplication.
So it's not just about quantity. The actual dynamics, the interactions inside the system can shift as the scale changes.
Exactly. And the book points out, as systems expand, complexity usually increases too.
Which can create new bottlenecks we didn't expect.
Right. A bigger system just has more moving parts, more connections, so more potential points of failure or strain. When you scale up, you have to think about that potential for new bottlenecks.
And the book mentions a way to build resilience during growth by keeping parts somewhat independent.
Yes, that's a key principle. Maintaining some degree of independence between different parts. If everything is too tightly interconnected.
A failure in one small part can bring the whole thing down.
Exactly. It makes the system fragile. Building in some modularity or redundancy helps prevent that kind of rapid cascade when things get bigger.
That idea of maintaining independence makes sense. Now, the book looks at those long-lived Japanese companies.
The ones that stay relatively small, often family-owned, focused locally.
Yeah. How does their strategy relate to scale?
Well, their incredible longevity, sometimes centuries, suggests they might be making a conscious choice. Prioritizing stability, deep customer connections in a manageable area, quality, over just rapid, massive expansion.
So maybe deliberately limiting their scale is part of their resilience.
It could be. It implies that for certain goals, maybe long-term survival and deep community ties, aggressively scaling up isn't always the best path. It might even introduce risks.
It's definitely a different model of success than just grow, 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 valuing sustainability.
Right. Then the book brings in JBS Haldane's essay on being the right size, illustrating how scale affects biology.
Yes, this sounds fascinating.
Haldane brilliantly shows how an animal's size dictates almost everything about it. Its structure, its abilities, its limits.
The famous examples about falling, right?
Exactly. He observed a mouse can fall from a huge height and probably be fine. A rat might get hurt. A human would likely break bone.
A horse
would just splatter, sadly. It's because weight increases with the cube of size, but surface area, which helps with air resistance, only increases with the square.
The ratios change dramatically with size.
It powerfully shows that the physical laws and biological rules that work at one scale just don't apply the same way at another. You can't just scale an insect up to the size of a human and expect it to function.
A very vivid reminder that the rules change with the size of the player. Okay, another example the book uses is the history of artificial light, how scaling up infrastructure changed everything.
Yeah, this is a fantastic example of scaling a basic technology having huge ripple effects on society.
Going from candles and oil lamps
to widespread gas lighting. That required a massive scaling up of infrastructure gas production, pipes running everywhere.
And that allowed
dramatically increased productivity. Factories could run safely and precisely at night.
Okay, big economic impact.
Huge, but also social impacts. It led to the rise of nightlife. Streets were safer, more inviting after dark. It enabled new kinds of entertainment, socializing, commerce.
So scaling up that one utility literally reshaped how society operated, how people lived and worked.
Fundamentally. Finally, the book touches on how engineers think about scaling systems. Specifically, the idea of a margin of safety.
Margin of safety, building in some buffer.
Exactly. Engineers know systems have to handle extremes, not just averages. When building a bridge,
they don't just design it for the average number of cars.
No way. They factor in potential traffic surges, extra heavy trucks, extreme weather, high winds, floods, earthquakes. Then they build in a significant margin of safety on top of that.
To ensure it can withstand those extreme stresses without failing.
Right. It doesn't make failure impossible, but it dramatically reduces the risk. And the book rightly points out, the higher the stakes, the bigger the potential cost of failure.
The larger and more critical that margin of safety needs to be when you're scaling things up.
It's about building in resilience, acknowledging uncertainty, and planning for extremes, not just the everyday average. Relying only on averages when scaling can be disastrous.
That makes perfect sense. Essential for building robust systems.
Absolutely. That principle of designing for extremes with a solid margin of safety is crucial for the reliability and stability of any system that grows significantly.
Wow. Well, this has been an incredibly illuminating deep dive, exploring feedback loops, equilibrium, bottlenecks, and scale, all through the lens of the great mental models Vol.3.
It really has. And understanding these concepts isn't just academic. Recognizing those feedback loops helps us adapt, change behavior, build trust.
Right. And understanding equilibrium gives us that framework for handling change, keeping things balanced, whether it's at home or work or anywhere else.
And let's not forget bottlenecks. Spotting them, dealing with them strategically, that's key for efficiency. And sometimes those constraints even spark innovation.
Definitely. And finally, grasping scale helps us anticipate challenges and opportunities as things grow or shrink, and reminds us to build in that resilience, that margin of safety.
Crucial for navigating complexity.
So, for our final thought today, something for you, our listener, to ponder. Think about a system that's important in your own life.
Could be anything. A project at work, a key relationship, maybe even just a personal habit you're trying to change.
Take a moment and try looking at it through these lenses. What are the feedback loops at play? Where might the bottlenecks be hiding, slowing things down?
How is scale affecting its dynamics? Is it growing, shrinking? What would happen if it did? And what state of equilibrium is it currently maintaining or trying to maintain?
What new insights pop up when you apply these models? It's actually a surprisingly powerful way to get a deeper handle on the complexities around us.
And hopefully, make some more informed choices as you move forward.